Hi, this is Dr. McCullough, and I'm joined today by Barbara Loe Fisher, who is the founder of the Vaccine Information Center, and she's been a leader and a pioneer in educating people about the concerns of vaccine safety and freedom of choice in the vaccine area, and really has been recognized for her leadership and appointed to several government committees as the consumer representative because she's had such a major leadership role in this area. And we're here today to talk about a concern that we have about yet another vaccine that's being seriously considered as being recommended on a regular basis for really very little benefit as far as we can see. And we'll get into the specifics, but that's the meningococcal vaccine for meningitis. And Barbara has really just come back recently from a committee, a government committee that
there was a stakeholder engagement meeting where vaccine stakeholders came together to talk about.
Was it sponsored by the government?
Sponsored by the Centers for Disease Control, yes.
Okay.
And
you were one of the lone representatives of the movement that expresses our concerns about vaccine safety, and really, do the risk outweigh any benefit, which is really the central element here, and something that every individual, we hope, will have the opportunity to make that choice for themselves, not be told by some government agency that's heavily influenced by conflict of interest and lobbied efforts by drug companies to make that choice for you.
Well, I think that with this vaccine, which is already recommended for kids 11 to 12 years old, as well as 16 years old now, as well as college freshmen. It started out with college freshmen. They want to add anywhere from 3 to 4 more doses at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, at 12 months of age of this meningococcal vaccine.
Well, before we go into that, why don't we just go back a little bit further about the way it's currently being implemented, and what is meningitis, and why is it being recommended, and how many people are affected? Because traditionally, it's been, as a physician, my experience is this is the disease that many college freshmen get when they go away to school and live in a dormitory and come down with this disease, and there may be minor epidemics, little outbreaks in certain areas in colleges as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, meningitis is an inflammation of the meninges of the brain. It's basically a brain inflammation. And the Neisseria meningococcal is
it can cause a variety of infections and other things that aren't infections. But we're concerned about the Neisseria
meningococcal, but there are other kinds of organisms like pneumococcal and Haemophilus influenza B also cause meningitis, inflammation of the brain. But it's interesting because vaccination from the very first vaccines, smallpox and rabies vaccines, also can cause inflammation of the brain in rare cases. So you kind of have an interesting situation here where the meningitis, the meningococcal disease, causes the same type of complications as the vaccine, and we can go over some of the signs of a brain inflammation later. But here's the situation with this vaccine. Neisseria meningococcal is only associated with about 1,400 to 3,000 cases in the whole United States every year out of 308 million Americans. There are 5 strains. There are strain A, B, C, Y, and W135. A third to half of the cases of Neisseria meningococcal disease is caused by strain B. That strain is not in the vaccine.
So that's the predominant strain.
Well, it's certainly in children
one.
under 5 years of age. About 66 to 70% of the cases are caused by strain B.
2/3. And this is the target age group that's being considered for this new vaccine recommendation.
It's actually children under 1. I think that the vaccine should be available for anyone who wants to use it. But the issue I have with a universal use recommendation by CDC for meningococcal vaccine for these children under 1 is that every time the CDC recommends a vaccine for universal use for children, in the last quarter century, almost all of those vaccines have turned into mandates, state mandates, meaning that we don't have a choice. And that's really, I think, the overarching issue that is becoming really a point of a lot of anxiety for parents is that it's not that the vaccines are being recommended. It's the vaccines are being mandated. They're being forced. And when anyone tries to make an educated voluntary decision, they are thrown out of a doctor's office. They are harassed. They're threatened.
Well, that's not necessarily even thrown out, but in many cases, many pediatricians, and that's fine. I'm a firm believer in freedom of choice, and I'm not faulting the pediatrician, but they will tell them they will not be seen by them anymore. They have to find a new doctor.
Right. They won't.
Which could be a potentially inconvenient, depending on what their health care coverage is.
Well, I mean, it's just it's a situation that is becoming very explosive, and so if you take an objective look at this potential recommendation, universal use recommendation by CDC for this vaccine, you have a couple of issues. You have a cost issue.
What is the typical cost of the series?
I think the vaccine is, it depends upon if you get it in a public health clinic or you get it in a private pediatrician's office. But we're looking at probably a lot of pediatricians about $100 a dose.
A dose?
Anywhere $60 to $100 a dose.
Oh my
gosh.
gosh.
I want to make sure I'm correct on that, but I think that's around the price.
Wow. So hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, I mean,
unless you're being subsidized by the government, and if it isn't a public health clinic, it's not that, well, the person's not going to pay for it, but eventually we all pay for it because it's paid for by the government, which is only either prints the money or takes it from taxes.
Right, no question. The vaccines that are provided in the public health clinics for a very reduced cost or no cost are subsidized by the taxpayer. Yeah. So, I mean, we're looking at a vaccine that'll be 6 doses, basically. It'll be 2, 4, 6 months, 12 months, 11 to 12 years old, and 16 years old. And if you haven't gotten, I guess, at freshman year, because Texas just made a mandate for meningococcal vaccine for freshmen, college students. Now, Texas has a conscientious belief exemption due to the amazing work of Don Richardson, who's now MVIC's Director of Advocacy. And by the way, everyone should sign up for MVIC's advocacy portal at mvicadvocacy.org because we are trying to protect the exemptions in the state. And certainly, if this vaccine becomes universal use vaccine, there will probably be states that will mandate it. And so it's important for us to protect these vaccine exemptions.
Yeah, there should be a link for that below here. So definitely, if you're not involved in that already, I would strongly encourage you to sign up for that because we can collectively make a huge difference in this. And we have. I mean, Dawn Richardson's efforts in Texas are a great example of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about protecting our right to choose. That is, if a mother wants to give her children, say there's been meningococcal disease in the family, and the mother believes that her child may be at risk for meningococcal disease, certainly she should have the right to have access to a vaccine. But we should not be forced to use a vaccine that we do not believe is either safe, effective, or necessary for our children. We need to have that right, and I am very concerned about this proposed policy, and that's why we have put out information that the CDC, and I have to give props to the CDC on this, they are holding public engagement meetings in cities. There's going to be a meeting in Denver, in Chicago, and in Seattle, and they've already held one in New Hampshire. But to get input from the public about what the public thinks about the addition of this meningococcal vaccine to the under 1 year old recommended schedule. And I hope everyone weighs in. And if they can't get there to the meetings, that they will write to the CDC.
And we'll have information for you also on how you can voice your concerns and your opinions to the CDC directly and let them know what you think and feel about this issue.
Yes. Because again, it's one thing to make the vaccine available, it's quite another thing to recommend it for every child and then force it.
Yeah, because essentially the impact of this recommendation, and is this with the ACIP committee?
Yes, ACIP.
ACIP Advisory Committee for the
Immunization
Practices, and that's a subset of the
Centers for Disease Control.
So if they come up with a recommendation, and in this case most likely to implement this vaccine schedule for meningitis, and the age groups you mentioned, and the schedule you mentioned, then that recommendation will be converted relatively quickly by most states, because it's a statewide implementation.
States are the ones that mandate vaccines.
And then, unless you have an exemption, which would be either be a conscientious objection, a religious exemption, or a medical exemption, then you're going to be required to receive those sets of immunizations, which, if you don't have access to the public health program, it's going to cost over $500-600 in addition to the other vaccines that's already being recommended, to have your child participate in the public education system.
That's what the gatekeeper there is entry to daycare and to schools. And I'd like to say a little bit about meningococcal disease, because I think it is a serious disease. It can result in limb loss. It can result in convulsions and brain damage. And so, you know, the signs and symptoms of meningitis, of inflammation of the brain, whether it's from a vaccine or from the disease, things like a severe headache. If your child can't, or you can't put your chin to your chest without huge amount of pain, and you have a headache and a high fever.
Or the head is rigid.
The head is rigid.
Yeah,
the neck
will not move. It's just like a board. It becomes very stiff.
Exactly. If you have vomiting and diarrhea, if you have convulsions, if you have confusion with the young babies, the screaming, high-pitched screaming and the arching of the back is often a sign of brain inflammation. You need to obviously get to a doctor, because meningitis, meningococcal disease, can move very quickly. And so you need to, when you see those kinds of symptoms, you need to get it checked out.
And it can be effectively treated if you pay attention to these symptoms that you've just mentioned, and you get appropriate health or evaluation and assistance at the emergency room, because this is an emergency.
Yes.
And they're given intravenous antibiotics. You can have a dramatic impact and really resolve it completely.
Yes. But so often it moves so fast, if you're not watching, if you're not paying attention, and you don't get to the hospital. And so of course, this has been the argument. It's such a severe disease. It can result in such, you know, death and brain injury, but we have to look at the incidence. Right now, 20% of us carry Neisseria meningococcal organisms in the back of our throat at any one given time. Okay, and we're asymptomatic. What is it about people who go on to have invasive meningococcal disease? That's what they really need to be looking at. What are the risk factors? The other thing is that most of us, by the time we're teenagers, already have natural antibodies to Neisseria meningococcal. Nature has a way of, you know, we come in contact, we're asymptomatic, but we get antibodies. What's going to happen when we no longer are having the natural antibodies, when we are children are getting vaccinated at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 12 months, and you have vaccine-induced antibodies, which are not the same.
They're not permanent.
They're not the same as the
temporary.
natural. We potentially have.
That's an important point, because
everything.
most people don't realize it. They believe that by getting an immunization, as recommended by the public health authorities, you're going to induce the same type of immunity that you would from natural exposure. And nothing could be further from the truth. Well documented. I think any respectable scientific researcher in this area would not dispute that.
Right. It's not the same as.
There are different types of immunity.
Exactly.
They're similar, but they're clearly different. And the permanent one that is typically received from having a natural exposure is far superior.
Right. Qualitatively superior. And I think that this is not something that's being looked at either. Are we going to become vaccine dependent? Are you going to see a mutation of this Neisseria meningococcal organism into a more virulent and a more prevalent form